Dr. Bhemula to continue his discussion. I hope in the meantime, Dr. Sunil Kant Behera, who is the advisor of this webinar series, academic advisor, he must have joined with us. I welcome Dr. Sunil Kant Behera to this webinar also. So again, I request all of our participants to mute your audio because we are getting a lot of background noise. So I hope you all will support and cooperate us to have a quality discussion without any audio interruptions. So again, I welcome all participants to our webinar, and also I welcome Dr. Bhemula to our webinar. So now I request Dr. Bhemula to continue his discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Padi, and my warm regards to him, and my warm regards to Professor Vera also for bringing us into this common platform of the webinar.
Professor Sunil Kant Behera, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir. And Rabindra Bhemula has some technical problem. Already he had joined, and we had already completed the brief introduction, and he was supposed to start his discussion. And he has some
actually,
problem.
I was not able to connect.
Our host is trying to get him, our host. So since Dr. Bhemula was supposed to speak on the health communication in the pandemic situation, strategies and approach. So my request to you, since you are our academic advisor, till Rabindra Bhemula joined with us. So since all of our participants are in the meeting room, so my request to you, so at least give a brief 5 to 10 minutes introduction about the subject, let the Bhemula join, so that the meeting hall will be very lively.
You see, the subject in the sense, if you look at the participants all over the country,
it's
a blend of teachers and scholars and even few students. And when we talk today about online education and online delivery mode, there are many studies now and there are many reports in the newspapers that online education has its pitfall. Now, but during the time of Corona, we have to be engaged in online education. And media, when we talk about media and communication studies particularly, this is such a vast field. What I have realized all these days, that we also need to bring in people from other disciplines also. Say, for example, communication has its roots in anthropology, has its roots in psychology, philosophy. So sometimes what I was thinking, Padibabu, that we can bring in experts from these anthropology, psychology, philosophy, and sociology also, which will broaden the horizon of my young colleagues. And with those linkages to other disciplines of study, perhaps we will be able to do justice in the evolution. It's evolving. Communication studies in India is still evolving. Now, suppose Uma Shankar Pandey talked yesterday about data journalism. Data journalism is a concept which is very new, and there were also questions whether data journalism means that we will be away from narrative journalism or what. No, it's not the thing. As narrative journalism and data journalism are here again, they complement and supplement each other. From data journalism, we will have to create a narrative. Data journalism is not only about numbers. Data journalism is not only about infographics. Data journalism is not only about, say, the tables and the scales and the pie charts, diagrams, all those things, spreadsheets or Excel sheets. From the data, we will have to find out what is invisible there in the data. Because data, now say for example, if I talk about the COVID situation today, Now, we always take the claim, the government of India takes the claim that initially the doubling rate was for 2 days or 3 days. But today, the doubling rate of the COVID infected patients has gone up to 12 days and 13 days. So, if statistically said, that is very right, they are very right. But if you look at the reality, initially the COVID infection patients were only 200, 300, 1,000. So, doubling rate of 1,000 certainly will be much less. But today we have about 1,60,000 COVID patients and doubling rate. Now, doubling is of 1,60,000. Certainly, it will take more time. So that is not a yardstick to measure and say that we have succeeded in our efforts to contain corona. No doubt, lockdown has helped us, and we talk more in terms of post-pandemic. We are forgetting about the present pandemic. Why to think about the post? What will happen after corona? Corona is here to stay. If you look at the international works also and the reports, corona is here to stay and we will have to learn to live with it. Mask has become a commodity which should be there with us. Hand washing should be a regular practice, and sanitizer is a regular thing that we need to have. So all these things, it will change our lifestyle, change our ways of life in times to come. So it's not only corona, it's about the health situation, it's about our health practices that we need to think about. So corona is like any other, it was new, it is a novel COVID-19. So we do not know much about its progress, much about its configuration, much about its impact or effect. So we are really worried. But this is also like any other virus. We have been able to contain the virus of typhoid and malaria and all those things. So in times to come, we will also be able to control the corona, but that will take a longer time. Now coming to media, basically during corona, during this pandemic, we have seen lot of media organizations, they are taking away the jobs of the reporters and the journalists. Unfortunate is the case in Hindustan Times and many other cases, because they do not have the revenue that they can earn through the advertising, and that is the reason why they say that we do not have money to pay back. Now it is time for media persons. Now Atmanirbhar Bharat, we say. So the journalists now need to find out entrepreneur skills. Now they need, we talk in terms of alternative media to the mainstream media. Now when there is a large scale, what I will say, large scale job loss in the media sector, then perhaps the time has come for we academics to teach more in terms of media entrepreneurship. How the students, how the people, how the media trained people can be entrepreneurs by themselves. Today, we no longer depend on the media, which is
Okay,
centralized.
sir,
Which
he
is,
joined. He joined
he has
actually.
joined?
Yes.
Okay then. Welcome, Ravindra.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
So getting from Shillong is a challenge.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. So can I request Nishit to share my PPT, because I think he has to operate the PPT from his side. My sincere apologies for the delay, because as you say, to get connected with Shillong is a very Herculean task, and then you have to struggle with the broadband and the internet and everything. All right. So health communication during a pandemic, and that is very important for us to understand in the current scenario, because now, as I said, everybody is talking about COVID-19, and now nobody is talking about the earlier problems that we have had. So I thought this will be an apt topic for students of journalism who would like to get into the specialized area of health communication, because health communication is the future, and that's where, if you want to look at it, right? So can I have the next slide, please? And And then we have to understand this is what World Health Organization and it actually typically defines a pandemic, and it says epidemic occurring worldwide or over a very wide area crossing international boundaries and usually affecting large number of people, and that is what is happening around the world. Yes, and if you we look at the entire scenario of pandemics and epidemics that have occurred in our country, and I'll take you back to 18th century when we had we had around 6 cholera outbreaks in India, starting from 1817, 29, 1852, 1863, 1881, and 1899. These were the six
Social charges
cholera
कितने लिए
outbreaks
होंगे?
that we have had in our country. And then we had plague, and that was in Bombay in 1896. We had Surat, we had 1994, and most of the health communication professionals actually give an excellent example of Surat. You know how
मैंने तो 2,500
Surat
भरे थे
municipal corporation was able to contain the plague, epidemic in a very shorter duration of
जियो
time, and
टीवी
how to
चलेगा
clean up the entire
ऊपर
city
रखो
was
ना
an
जियो
example.
टीवी
And then in 2002 we had plague in Shimla,
तो
and
से
everybody
यूनिवर्सिटी
is
में
talking
सामने
about
जियो
Spanish flu now. That happened in
अगर नहीं
1918.
चला का पुष्पान
But it is not something which has come from Spain, right? Because that is where the problem of the nomenclature is. The way the President Trump says, Spanish flu, the China fever or a China flu, that is he's talking about. Whereas COVID, when you say coronavirus, may not have come from China at all. It must have come from other place as well. The same thing can be attributed to the Spanish flu, because Spain was the first country that reported about this epidemic, and and that's where it started to be called as the Spanish flu. And then we had polio, where the last case that we had in India was in 2011. We have been able to put together an excellent health communication campaign, and we were able to contain this entire epidemic called polio. And then we had smallpox, which we have been able to contain. HIV/AIDS, it's still continuing, but and I'm sure there is the kind of the prevalence that has come down in India is remarkable. Then in dengue, we had 2003, 2006, we had dengue, we had SARS in 2003, we had meningococcal meningitis in 2005. Chikungunya came, Gujarat jaundice came, H1N1 flu had come in. So that is where we draw parallels now with the COVID-19. We had Odisha jaundice in 2014. We had Indian swine flu in 2015. Nipah had come in Kerala, where it was talked about bats living in a well, which had affected our family. And then that's also given as an excellent case study where how the Kerala government was able to contain Nipah only to that particular affected area, and it did not spread. And of course, COVID-19. And COVID-19, it came into, we started talking about COVID-19 in end of 2019, and we say it was only regulated to China, and then it does not have any kind of a, let's say it won't spread around. And that is where we started talking about it as a China flu. Can we have the next slide, please? Next, please. Yeah. And that is where, World Health Organization, when it actually realized, this is a kind of a pandemic, which was, it was declared pandemic in the early, in the late December or early January. And then they decided there has to be a certain kind of an action plan. And that's where they came up with the risk communication and community engagement action plan. And this tool was specifically designed to support risk communication, engage community staff and responders working on national health authorities, and also involve the local partners and other stakeholders to help prepare and protect individuals, families, and the public health during early response to COVID-19. And if you, this is a web link that I've given. If you go to this web link, you will see it is a kind of a comprehensive document that the World Health Organization has put in to do a certain kind of a baseline survey about how people come to know about the corona and how they engage themselves with the sources of information that come to them. They also engage with another kind of health authorities and how this health seeking behavior has actually come in. And that is where this is a very excellent document that has really been referred to in the current context. And this is a document that has been referred by many of the countries around the world to engage their community in this is in this kind of situation that we are in. The next slide, please. So in specifically what happens in health communication, next slide, please. Health communication, there are three-pronged strategy that we always do. One, no, the previous one, please. Previous one. Yeah. So what happens, in health communication, one, we try to understand a disease, we try to understand a pandemic firsthand. And then we try to relate to it with a kind of a diagnostic approaches that we need to take out to address that kind of a pandemic or epidemic that has come in. And the second level that we always try to tackle with is where, where a particular pandemic or epidemic comes in, it is always overpowered by myths and superstitions. And you take HIV, there was enormous number of myths and superstitions. And before that, we had polio. People had kind of superstitions, and we had a terrible time. And that is where most of the energies of health communication go into fighting these myths and superstitions. Once we are able to fight these myths and superstitions, then only we are able to address a particular kind of a health pandemic that is really affecting us. The next slide, please. So I'll just take you through a couple of myths and superstitions that World Health Organization has put together, and it relates to all the countries around the world, right? As maybe, and then let's say there are some people are saying that there are certain kind of drugs, and that is where you had this entire kind of news that was coming in saying that the President Trump is asking for hydroxychloroquine from India. And then we were all going gaga about how India produces lots of hydroxychloroquine tablets. And then he said that is the only treatment. But whereas the fact is, there are no licensed drugs that are available right now to prevent COVID-19. The next one, please. And then we had another, the next one, please. And then, the previous one. And then we had the previous one. Hello. Yeah. And then we had, the second one after this slide, please. Yeah. And then we had, adding pepper to food, and the previous one, please. And maybe I think you should go one by one, Nitish. Yeah. And then we said, no, the previous one. Slide number 7. Yeah.
You have a slide number before here in the top, the previous
this
one.
This is something which we all talked about.
Yeah, this
saying that because, and this is a kind of, we are saying that Indians consume so much of food which is full of spices, full of condiments, and they said it will not affect us, right? And that is where, WHO had to go back again to the drawing board and say, this is a kind of a myth that is getting circulated. And that is where, the next one, please, slide number 7, right? And that is where World Health Organization had to really look into it, right? And then saying that, hot peppers in your food, though be tasty, cannot prevent or cure COVID-19. The next one, please. And the next one, we said, if we add garlics, slide number 8, yeah, if we say and then say we said do vaccines against pneumonia. And that is where, we are talking about this HIV, let's say the Haemophilus influenza type B vaccine that we are talking about. Saying that the Indians have been taking a vaccine since their childhood, and they have, a certain kind of, immunity towards it. So Indians are not, will not get affected by corona, but that has been proven wrong, because the kind of the prevalence that has come in, the kind of effect, the spread of virus that has happened in India, that's the kind of a thing that we need to understand, that this is a myth that has been floating around. Next one, please. Right. Slide number 9.
Yeah, this is
and
the
then
one.
we had eating garlic will help infection, and that is what saying that Indians eat a lot of garlic and Indians will not get affected by corona. The next one, please. Slide 10.
This is the 10th one.
Yes, yeah. And then we had another kind of a myth that was going around saying that rinsing your nose with saline water will help infection from the new coronavirus. There is no evidence about that supports actually about it. The next one, please. Slide 11. And then, then we had these issues about the house flies, saying that the house flies actually are responsible because they carry the droplets around, and then when a person sneezes or speaks or coughs, and the flies take it around. But that's a complete myth actually. The next one. Slide 12, please. Yeah. And then, of course, there was a joke that was going around where a political leader said, if people can use alcohol-based hand wash and it can kill virus, the people can also drink alcohol, because alcohol, if it's there in soap, hand wash, it will also definitely, kill the virus that is there inside. But that is where they say, drinking methanol, ethanol, or bleach does not prevent or cure COVID-19. And that is where it can be extremely dangerous. That is what HIV had to know. But the World Health Organization had to go around and tell people about it. Slide 13, please. Right. And the next one, is saying that spraying or introducing bleach. And if you must have seen, saying that whenever when you we watched news about corona, you've seen people being sprayed bleach, and there was disinfectant were being no, they were was used on them, and then we had all this bleaching activities and all those things happening. But it's there is no kind of proven formula which actually talks about it, saying that whether it is able to contain the coronavirus or not. Next one, please, slide 14. And then, of course, and this is something which we all talked about, the Great Indian Summer, saying that, let the summer come in India and the corona will go away. And, we are in the middle of the summer, and I believe most of the countries are facing temperatures between 42 to 48. And wherever the temperature is high, the corona prevalence is also very high, right? And so that's a kind of a myth. Next, please. And then, of course, a couple of developed countries were talking about, saying that, because 5G networks and the people are not able to, the network is actually, the radio waves is actually affecting them. And that's the reason they're dropping dead. And that's where they had to, World Health Organization has also had to come in and say, no, it's not, nothing has to do with 5G. Next, please. And of course, and this is something we also talked about, holding your breath for 10 seconds or more without coughing or feeling discomfort does not mean, and that's what they say, if I can hold my breath and I'm not affected by corona. And that's one thing that was a myth that was also going around. Next, please. And of course, cold weather, and this is something where people were also telling us, saying that you have to be careful in Shillong because Shillong is a very cold place, and that is where the coronavirus will not be able, it will survive for long, and that's something which we all talked about. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then of course, taking a hot bath, and next, please. Next one. And of course, we had this mosquito bites. This mosquito bites thing is a very interesting phenomenon. They're saying that because India being in a tropic country, an arid country where the mosquitoes are very prevalent, and then for every other ailment, we always relate it to with the mosquito, because we have the example of dengue, we had the example of chikungunya, we had example of malaria. So we will say, and then we related to with HIV, and then we struggled a lot to tell people saying that HIV is not transmitted by mosquito bites. Now again, at the same thing, the government is also, governments all around the world, even in African subcontinent, in Latin America, they're all trying to tell people, it cannot spread by mosquito bites. Next, please. And of course, exposing yourself to sun or temperature higher than 25 does not spread. And this is what people also say. Next, please. I'm just taking you through a couple of superstitions that are there, and this is something like we say ultraviolet lamps should not be used to disinfect hands or other areas of skin. And that's something which we have been talking about. And there's another kind of a superstition that's going around in the country saying that, if you put your air conditioner with a less than 26 degrees, the chances of spread of corona is very high. That's not substantiated. And that's a certain kind of a myth that is going around for the people to consume. Next, please. And then does the new coronavirus affect older people or younger people who are also susceptible? There is no certain kind of a proven data that we have as of now, but we say it can affect any kind of a population, and that's, but why we are saying the younger people have to stay home and the older people more than 60 have to stay home. It's only because of their immune system has become weakened out, and they might be suffering from multiple health ailments. And that's the reason we suggest that people more than 60 and young children below 10 should be there at home. And of course, the issue about antibiotics, and then, yeah, next, please. And then we have issues about antibiotics. Next, please, Nishit. Yeah, the next one. Next one, please. Yeah, and then of course, we have antibiotics. And this is where one of the chief minister of one state saying, before the corona had come in, and then before the lockdown came into picture, the chief minister said, everybody should consume paracetamol. And once paracetamol is consumed, your body immune system gets better, and and then you can beat corona. And this is what we have also learned, saying that when people were being brought to India, from different countries, what they also played us a simple kind of a trick, saying that they gobbled one paracetamol before the check was happening, or the thermal scanning was happening at the airport. And when they came back to India, and they were COVID positive when they came back. So that's a certain kind of thing that we need to look at it. The next one, please. And then of course we have specific medicines, not yet, because we have been getting a lot of inputs about it, saying that is Ayurveda a treatment, and then we had homeopathy come in, and then we had there's so many other kind of arguments or treatment, arguments that are really coming in, but we do not have a certain kind of a strong evidence as of now whether one particular kind of medicine is able to treat people or maybe able to prevent people from the coronavirus impact. Next, please. And of course, hand dryers are effective in killing the new coronavirus. This is something which has been going around. Next, please. Yeah. Now, looking at it, what are the public health challenges that we have? And if you look at it in Indian condition, one, we can say the spread, we have been able to contain COVID-19 for a long time. But ever since we started opening up the travel, when we say the air travel started happening and the train travel started happening, slowly what had happened, the people started moving places. And then when they started moving places, the seamless travel was the one which was very much responsible in, making for the spread of the virus around the country. And that's the reason why you see there is a spike in cases in the recent past, where the people are traveling by train and the people are taking they are flying back and the airlines have started. So when this this is a certain kind of a proven theory, whereas in Spanish flu also saying that because Spanish flu was mostly regulated in the certain parts of the country and did not go to other countries because the seamless travel was not there. But in the current condition, when the COVID-19 came in, because of the seamless travel, people were traveling from one part of the another part of the country and they were carrying diseases with them. And that became a very important phenomenon. And the second one is different viruses affect different population. That is what I was telling you, saying that the young people, the virus, the way it is being, mutating and the way the different forms of mutation, the mutative forms are really coming out, we have to understand saying that, there are viruses is affecting different population in a different way, right? So the young population, which we thought, because they have had their vaccination schedule done and they have HIV vaccine, all that thing, we were not able to, we were looking at that. So the different viruses are affecting different set of population, and that is a certain kind of a challenge that we have for health communication now. Now, how do we communicate to the people who are below, who are young, and in the school? Or maybe how do we communicate to the youth, and how do we communicate to the older generation? How do we communicate to the working population? So there are different sets of communication strategies that we had to bring in. And the third one is that the public health is the best defense that we have. If you have seen in the recent past, we have been, the public health in India has changed tremendously, and it has changed in a very in a positive manner. And that is where, if you look at it, the World Health System has been able to react to the pandemic, which has come in an emergent situation, right? And that's where, if you see our health system in the hospitals, our doctors, our nurses, they're all well equipped now. And that is where we say, public health is the best defense. And I'm going to talk a little bit more public health in my next few slides as well. And of course, taking example from COVID-19 and the Spanish flu that we had in 1918, crowd control works. And that is where the one term that we frequently use is social distancing. But rather, in health communication, we don't call it as a social distancing, we say it is a physical distancing. Right? So physical distancing from one another, and then refraining yourself, protecting yourself, and it's actually is what helps actually in that sense, right? So these are a couple of 4 challenges, the major challenges that we have as of now. Next slide, please. And if we look at the lockdown and its benefit, we had 4 stages of, we are in the 4th stage of lockdown, and the 5.0 may come into place. But if you look at it, the lockdown phase 1 was all driven by the fear psychosis. And that's where health communication campaigns that the government had taken out, or maybe most of the governments around the world had to, we're looking at, how to address that fear psychosis, right? Because there's a certain kind of a heightened risk perception that is really coming in. People were all fearing, there's an element of doomsday that was predicted about at that point of time. And in India, it also got a communal angle when we started blaming one set of population, one set of religious congregation we are talking about, and it got a communal angle. But of late, nobody's talking about that communal angle anymore, because it started affecting many people around the world now. Like, there's no, it does not see any difference between what religion, what sect, what community do you come from. It affects everybody equally. And then, of course, in the lockdown phase 1, we're all talking about it as a foreignness of COVID-19. The way we treated HIV long back, saying that India is a very close-knit society, we cannot have HIV, but and the same way we thought COVID-19 is a foreign thing, so it will not affect us. And then we, because of the lockdown phase 1, we were able to restrict movement of people. We were able to curtail the community spread in the lockdown phase 1. But the lockdown phase 2 led to the rise of stigma, and it also led to the element of reverse migration that was happening, where the workers were all going back to their homes, right? And then it also gave rise to the stigma where the doctors, when the nurses, the health workers were all targeted. And if I can say, we had a case in Shillong where the doctor of a famous hospital, he was the owner of that hospital, he died because of COVID-19. And there's a certain kind of stigma that was attached to his dead body, and he was not allowed to be consigned to flames, and he was not allowed to be buried. And it took around 48 hours for that thing to happen. And then we had, the reverse migration. This is something which we'll have to address again, saying that, why are these workers going back to their home? And this. So this is something which I will discuss in a few minutes later. And of course, in lockdown phase 2, along with the phase 1, we were able to enhance our health capabilities, and we were able to bring in the PPEs, we were able to bring in the masks, and we were able to put up COVID-19 specific hospitals, and then we started classifying them into zones. And with everybody is well aware about the red, orange, and green zones. Next slide, please. Next slide, yeah. And then, of course, the lockdown 3, we had limited economic activities we started, and then we started easing of travel restrictions. And easing of travel restrictions was the one which was also responsible for the spike in cases that we had. And then, of course, lockdown 4, we had air and train travel started coming in, and then we started preparing for the lifting of lockdown. Last slide, please. And then if you look at it, what are the major health communication challenges that are really coming? One, hand wash and personal hygiene has become a new norm, right? Because people are looking at it as a heightened risk perception, right? And because when they were made to sit at home and where they were not allowed to go out, they saw a disruption in their regular activities because they were not going out, they're not working, they are just sitting at home. So what had happened? They started practicing the hand wash and personal hygiene, right? Okay. And so now if you see, the people are able to do that, right? People are regularly hand washing, and this is a campaign that we had run for the last 30, 40 years as part of a sanitation campaign, because of this open defecation free and then hygiene, personal hygiene. We were talking about hand wash for a long time, but people were not taking it seriously. Now, suddenly with the COVID-19, because of the heightened risk perception, people are going back to hand wash now, right? People have made it a part of their habit now. It has become a new norm, right? So this is what, as a health communication, we need to really look at it, saying that people will continue with this kind of a habit for quite some time, right? So what happens is that people will be able to go back to, they'll be able to, retain that kind of a behavior. And then of course, you have the risk benefit analysis of reverse migration. We need to address these workers who are going back home. We need to address their health seeking behaviors. And then we need to actually look into it in a larger dimension, saying that what exactly are they really looking at? Because when they were working in a different metropolis, and they did not have access to health facilities. Whereas, and that's the reason why they were all going back, and they want to have access to the health facilities where they actually come from. So that's one thing we have to really look at. And of course, we have coexistence with COVID-19. This is what the government has been telling us very strictly. Because saying that now we got lockdown phone every four when it has come in, everybody says, okay, now let's live with COVID. And that's where we initially said there is a severity of this COVID-19, and it has become a new normal now. And we also understand the role of multiple stakeholders in this entire health communication now. The Indian Council for Medical Research, the Government of India, and the World Health Organization. These are multiple stakeholders who will continue to design and define our perceptions about COVID-19 as we go along. Final one, yes, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now the previous one, yeah. Now, what is the future of COVID-19? Saying that now World Health Organization and Government of India is looking at issuing immunity passports for people, saying that people who have already got affected by corona and who have recovered, who have already antibodies being in their body, they may be given an immunity passports, and that's something like where they can go around and they can have a free movement about saying that and they have already been affected. Something like that can be a kind of a future that we can look at. Now, that's what is World Health Organization is mooting. And of course, because most of us have been staying at home for the last 60 days, 65 days, and of course, it has completely impacted our mental health. And then I believe, once this lockdown is lifted, I believe as we live with COVID-19, we'll also have to live with this kind of issues about mental health, right? And of course, there'll be enhanced stress on health systems due to COVID-19, because if you see, because most of the hospitals, health facilities are overburdened by COVID-19 now. And what has happened is that if you look at them, there's other diseases that we Indians or the other people, we have been suffering from has been negligent. We have pushed it to the background. And of course, there'll be diversion of funds toward COVID-19 that will also again lead to a certain kind of problem where we'll not be able to have access to, how people address to other diseases that are prevalent in India. And of course, and that's what I said, there will be a rise in hand wash and personal hygiene. I see it as an immediate future that at least for 6 months or 1 year, people will continue with this kind of a healthy habit that has come into them. But we have to see if the COVID-19 fades away, or comes in a different form, people may not be, continuing with this kind of a hand wash or personal hygiene. And of course, and because of this COVID-19, people are not going out, people are not eating out, people are not eating junk food. So we say, as a health communication person, saying that, it has led to a certain kind of a responsible consumption and production, right? And that's where actually, we have been able to, that's what the World Bank and World Health Organization said, because of the stress, obesity, and, or stress related disorders are no more there. The people are consuming, very responsibly. So that's something which we are also looking at, saying that because of COVID-19, other diseases other ailment that we were actually addressing to has been taken care of. So that's something, it is a brief presentation that I've been able to put together. I hope I've been able to bring in as much as possible, but the last slide, please. And if you want to know more, you can write to me. Yeah, last slide, please, Nishit. Yeah, thank you so much. And then if you have any questions, any observations, you can definitely write to me and I'm there to help you out. Thank you so much, sir.
Oh, Dr. Bhimula, do you have another file? Can you show you?
Yes, sir.
You had sent us two, one PDF, another one, some document.
Yes, sir.
Should we share that document right
now?
Yes,
sir. If we can share the document, I think.
Nishit, please help us. He had two attachments, one PDF and another one document. You please share that document. So yes, this sir, is the document.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So can you please make it into full screen so that everybody can see and see what exactly has gone into the World Health Organization?
Yeah, it is in full screen now.
Yeah, in strategizing, the entire. So you can just go through this document so that everybody can look at it.
Is this okay now?
Yes. Okay, so this is COVID-19 preparedness and response. So you can just slide down quickly, right? And this is for the journalism students specifically and who have interest in health communication. You can use this document as a certain kind of a tool, a certain kind of where you can generate data in your own neighborhood, and then or maybe in your own locality, trying to understand how people have come to understand about corona. Please go down, please. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Please. Or more, or thoda, or yeah. Go down. You just go down. Yeah. Keep going, please. Yeah. Right. So this is a kind of a planning tool. If you look at it, saying that it actually talks. Yeah. Can you please stop at this one? Yeah. If you look at it, it talks about where have the people come to know about corona? How much do they know about corona? What are the different aspects of corona? Who told you about it? So what happens, in health communication? Let me be very honest here. When health communication has to tackle two enemies, and the two enemies are one is the WhatsApp university, another is the Facebook university, right? Because these are the people who spread so much of misinformation and a disinformation kind of a thing, where health communication people have to again go back to the drawing board and try to address that, right? because you can talk about when there's availability of too much of data, because you have Wi-Fi at home, you have Geo gives you data, and the too much availability of data, people are able to share information, misinformation very quickly. So that to counter that, kind of information, we have to have these kind of, systems in place. And this is where the qualitative assessment tool of World Health Organization actually addresses this one, saying that, where have you heard about it? Do you have any kind of a perceptions about it? What are the myths that you are having? And those, if you, this document is available on World Health Organization's website, and it's a risk communication and community management document. I suggest whoever is interested should go to World Health Organization and download this and use it as a reference tool. And it's very, very effective to understand. And this is what we have done for HIV and AIDS. We have done it for polio. We have done it for leprosy. And this is a kind of a risk assessment. That is what we say in communication, what we call as a communication needs assessment, right? So needs assessment is more understanding. But as of now, we're trying to do a qualitative assessment, saying that how do people understand a particular kind of pandemic, which is, we call it as the COVID-19. Yes, please. Yeah. I think that should be enough, sir. People can download this one, sir. Yeah. See, if you look at, where did you come to know about information from? Radio, TV, WhatsApp, Facebook, and then, you have. So this is a kind of, you should look at this document. It's a wonderfully done document by World Health Organization, and all the countries in the world are using this document to do a certain kind of baseline study to understand the perceptions about people. And I believe the Indian Council for Medical Research has also referred to this one and done some studies, seroprevalence studies, and then they have been able to come out with the communication campaigns that are doing it. The health messages that we get, and they're doing it on that basis. Yes, sir. Oh, that will be all, sir, I think. And yeah, Nishit, thank you so much.
So now you go for the Q&A. I
Yes,
request all the participants, whatever the questions they have, they can put it in one line. Our host Nishit will coordinate that part. Please coordinate, Nishit, that the Q&A.
This is the only one question.
Okay, yeah. Dr. Ajita, yes, yeah. He says, saying that how can educators seize the opportunity and inculcate the values or I spoke of in a conservative consumerist society. Dr. Ajita, we have to really look at it as a kind of an opportunity, right? Where, because if you look at the kind of discussions that are happening around the world about Corona, and the very first instant that we all talk about, the kind of initial health message that had come in, we started talking about personal hygiene. And personal hygiene was coupled with, hand wash. And this is what we have been doing for the last 40 years as part of our wash campaigns. We were not so successful, and we did campaigns about putting up taps in school here, there, and then we did a lot of campaigns to tell people about the personal hygiene. Yes, and then that is where we were, because of this rise in Corona, there's certain kind of a thing that we'll be able to tackle with is about the personal sanitation issues, and then the diseases that are related to the unhygienic habits that people had. So this we have been able to address to. But if you say, we are talking about the consumerist and the conservative society, yeah, we have to agree with that fact, because we are a consumerist society. We go by what the media tells us, and we go by what the digital world tells us, and that is where the kind of a consumptions of hand washers or the masks that have come in is running completely on that consumerist kind of idea. But if you look at it conservative, yes, because initially when we were having discussion on Corona, when it was there in China, most of the health communications around the world were talking about, and in India we were talking about saying that, oh, we wash our hands, and before we go to have our food, we always wash our hands. We also, wash our hands after using the washroom. So the chances of Corona spread in India is negligible. But now look at it, we have crossed 1.5 lakhs, and then we have 4,500 odd people who have died because of Corona. So any message, it has its own trajectory, it takes its own time. So it goes in slowly, and then so that's how slowly people will be able to relate to that kind of situation.
Sir, we have a
So-
second question.
Okay, worldwide the corona infection is decreasing, but in India it is increasing. Along with corona, rainy season is started. How to save from multiple crisis situation? Yes, if you talk, yes, there are multiple crisis situations that we have now. Because last week we had the cyclone, and cyclone was coupled with corona, and then the rainy season, the floods. And if you look at Assam, Assam has clearly said that all the people who had to come before June, because if by July it will start raining, it will be flooded, and that you can't do that. So that's the kind of situation in a country like India, which is so diverse, so populated, and then if you say the cases in India are rising, but if you do a comparative statement, saying that the population of India is around 1.2 billion, say 2011 census, and out of which we have only 1.5 lakh people who have got affected by corona, right? And then the recovery rate, the ICMR says is around 45%. So I see, in my situation is that the situation is gonna stabilize after some time, and hopefully the curve will go down, right? But that again depends on the kind of a guidelines that the government is giving, right? When the government says, personal hygiene, social distancing or physical distancing, wearing a mask is compulsory. So if the onus, the government and the World Health Organization and ICMR has onus on us now, saying that you are responsible. Now you take control of the entire thing. If you are able to take control of the, take control of the virus, take control of your own personal hygiene and your own, your own thing, the spread of corona will be taken care of, right? So that's something which we are looking at. Yes, sir.
So we have a number
What
third
is the
question.
take on primary health sector in India? How he looks at Delhi government issue Mohalla clinic? Does the propose government to work? Honestly, Mohalla Clinic of Delhi government is an excellent initiative, and which I believe, as a community level, when you're going out and reaching out to people at the community and you're addressing, the issues about that was long needed for us, because if you look at the entire structure of our health system, and then we have the primary health center or the sub center at the bottom, but sub center is not able to cater to all the people, the health needs and health seeking behaviors. But Delhi government's, Mohalla Clinic was an excellent initiative that the government had done. And then where, people in the same community are able to access, the health facilities. And I believe that those are the places where the people will get demystified information, or the information which is true, which is fact, and which needs to be done. So that should be a kind of a guideline, that should be a kind of a benchmark for us, where we should be able to understand it. Because whatever the government tells you by through television, through radio, through web, is something just come, which happens in a different way, right? But community level, addressing the community, their needs, their requirement, their sanity, because that's more important. Yes, please.
We have a question.
I'm a mother of 4-year-old child. When is the right time to send him again to school? Ma'am, you'll have to wait for some time. I believe, during my discussion, as I said, different virus affects different set of population, and I believe, young children are more prone to, because their immune system is just building up now, and it will take some time for them to, build and to have that kind of a resistance toward this kind of external viruses, which is more affecting many people at the same time. But I believe you should wait for how the government and reacts to it, and how the human resources development and the school authorities decide. But it's too, I believe, let the kids stay at home and learn, ma'am. I think this is the best time for them to be there with you and learn, and have a home learning kind of a thing. Next question. What role will health communication in future light of current pandemic, that similar pandemics contained in the future without any plan of action? Priyam, any pandemic or any epidemic is, it's unplanned, because, how prepared we may be, how effective we may be, is a particular kind of a health system always fails to, react to a certain kind of health system, the kind of a situation that really comes in. our health system was perfect, and our health system was in place. We were able to contain. If you look at the success examples in India, you look at polio, you look at smallpox, you look at leprosy, then you look at all other kind of a thing. We were able to contain those kind of epidemics and pandemics in a larger sense. Now, the World Health Organization gives an example of India when we talked about the polio eradication in India. India is polio free now, and that is where the World Health Organization chief was saying, we are looking up to India to learn how they are able to contain COVID-19. So we'll have to wait for some time and see how things turn out and how, because I cannot say the corona will go away and there's a new pandemic that will come to us. We never know, right? Because when corona was coming in, there was a news that the Ronto virus was coming, which is coming through rats also. It was not authenticated. Nobody knew about it, and then that's a kind of news that went viral, and people were talking about it. So our health system is equipped, is on case-to-case basis. We are actually, and that's what is really happening, right? That various media channels, there should be special health experts as health communicators so that factual and authentic news is reported. But already media channels are running short of revenue. What your take on this? Priya, I think most of the television channels now are running COVID-19 24/7, right? Because any channel you pick it up, they're all talking about corona and they're all talking about COVID-19. They're all talking about this thing only. Yes, this is a good idea, and I believe initially many of the channels had brought in health experts that were talking about health communication, and they were all doing about it. They were talking about the various pros and cons of corona, and that's going to happen. But where we fail, where we are actually struggling, is that people have access to the social media and uninterrupted access to social media. So when you have uninterrupted access to social media, and that is what feeds your information database that you run in your mind. So people are more engaged in that kind of a content that is coming in. But getting people to watch TV, learn about the facts, it takes some time, right? So because slowly, after some time, it will be, it'll happen. But now people have realized, the importance of health experts and actual health communicators to come out and talk about these things. Right, Nishit, or that's all, or we have more questions?
Yeah, so all the questions is over. Upendra sir?
Yes, Nishit. We have Professor Sunil Kant Behera, our advisor, with us. Professor Sunil Kant Behera sir is with us. Sir, I would like to request you to give a final touch to the whole discussion today, discussion by Dr. Ravindra. You can put some words to his discussion, sir.
Thank you, Professor Padi. And first, I must thank Ravindra Vemula for his wonderful and very structured talk on COVID-19. You started with the evolution and the various pandemics that the world has faced right from the 18th century. You talked about what is a pandemic and how we are prepared and what are the myths particularly. You talked about 18, 19 myths that people believe in and what is the reality. And you talked also about the strategies and the whatever we have gained through the lockdown, first phase, second phase, third phase, and fourth phase. And you talked about the challenges as well as the future. Now, a few things I think Priyam has asked about that. As media educators, how do you place health communication? Because in most of the universities, health communication is not a very important part of the curriculum. Yes. Now, do you believe that health communication, the time has come for us to make health communication a very important component of our curriculum, or should we have a separate course on health communication?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
If you take, for example, from 2000 onwards, there are about 10, 12 pandemics, from meningitis, from swine flu, from SARS and everything. So that has become a very recurring feature of the Indian society. Now that's one. Secondly, I was waiting to hear something about the role of media during this pandemic. Of course, you have made references during question answer session that television 24/7 channels are there which are talking about COVID-19, and but the major problem is with the social media because of the information overload, that is the content that is created to social media. But social media is here to stay. We can't do away with that. So as a media communicator, as a media researcher, what is your take on that? How do we face such a situation, such a dichotomous situation where people need to listen to the mainstream media to get authentic information, but people are always engaged in the social media because they find it very interesting for them, because they can create content. Lastly, and you have written some books on health communication. I know you are an expert on health communication. You said that we were ready. The government of India was ready to face such a pandemic. Do you believe that we have learned enough from the previous pandemics that we had? Or are we treating all these pandemics in isolation? I believe, I know that COVID-19 is a very new virus, and this pandemic is new. We can't prepare ourselves. But there is some amount of general preparedness. If you look at the public health system, I'm not talking of today's public health system during this COVID-19, but prior to that. Look at the public health system where if you look at the 75% of people, those who live in rural areas, we have public health centers, but people do not get the right kind of treatment, right kind of medical advices, right kind of medical information they are not getting. How can you say that our public health system was in place? What's your take on these few things? Or else your presentation was really wonderful. I have learned a lot of information, particularly about COVID-19. But as a media educator, what will be your take on health communication to be a part of the curriculum, or it should be a separate curriculum, a separate degree? And what is your take on the role of mainstream media and social media, and how do we deal with such a dichotomous situation?
Thank you, sir. So I have 3 points. I'll try to address them as quickly as possible to the best
Yeah,
of my abilities. Uh, Health communication as a separate course, we have, I tried to take it up long back when I was working with Micah, and we wanted to have a 1 year
yeah.
postgraduate diploma in health communication. And they said there's no saleability in health communication, because how can you sell health communication? People will not be able to come for health communication. I believe University of Hyderabad also did a small program on health communication. They had only 2, 3, 4 students kind of a thing, and they had to give up.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I realized, saying that if you want to bring in health communication as an area of specialization for students of journalism, it should be one unit in completely in development communication. So when students learn about development communication, they should also learn about health communication, learn about the best success stories that we have in India. We have excellent examples on health communication in India, and we also have failures, right? So if you say population control is the biggest failure, and so if you talk about, some people will say population has stabilized in India, but if you look at it in a sense, so health communication as a part of curriculum should come in development communication, because that is where most of the universities, because we follow the UGC's diktat, and UGC tells us, and this is what you have to do. So as a development communication, we have to include one component or one unit completely dedicated to health communication. We will talk about strategies, we'll talk about a certain, that's something which we have to do it. And there are certain universities which are also offering it as a elective, but it's not a core subject. So that's something which we have to really look at. And the second one, the thing that you raised about whether what is the role of the mainstream media? Mainstream media, with 600 plus television news channels running 24/7, is a very difficult thing for us to sit as a media educator and comment on, because mainstream media, like somebody had raised a question saying that, because all about revenue. Right, what sells? So initially they were able to do stories on COVID-19, the lockdown, how people are violating it, what is the police doing, what is the administration doing. That's the kind of a thing they've been able to do it. But most of the television channels were able to talk about the health communication strategies, but they were not able to elaborate more on that because they didn't find any kind of novelty in that. And because people were not keen, saying that how can you go and tell people more about sanitation, hand wash, mask, and all that thing. So that's something, and that is what where the mainstream media has to also relocate its role. But because one and you say it's like a political economic model kind of a thing, the economics which runs the entire television industries in India now, in the media also. So that's something as a case study that we take back to our classroom, right?
Yeah.
We had a pandemic, we have a pandemic, and we take it as a case study, saying that, well, how do the media talk about it, right? So how did the media talk about how it should have so but telling the mainstream media to have health communicators, health experts is
Yeah.
right? And the third
Yeah.
one that you all talked about is whether the Indian health system was prepared for this one or not. Yeah, that's a very valid question that people have always raised, saying that was India ready for COVID? And that people have also raised questions about why India did not react when it came up in December, end December. And when it was declared as a pandemic, why India did not react, and why did we take it up only in the mid-March, right? Again, I'll tell you, because there's a certain kind of lackadaisical attitude that we had, saying that, and we were all driven by the, let's say, India great kind of perception that we always carried. Our Indians, we cannot have corona, we cannot have HIV, and unless and until it comes in, we realize, this is something which has to happen. But yes, in a sense, I say initially because of this corona, the health system was overburdened. Now, slowly, because of the private-public partnership, many hospitals, many health facilities have really come up in a quick time. And this is a monumental task that has happened. Right, the stadiums are kind of getting converted into quarantine. Private institutions are coming up with COVID-specific hospitals. This is something in 60 days. Such kind of facilities have come up is really a very Herculean task and has to be commended. And the health personnel who have worked, who are health facilities which have responded to this has to be. So if the lockdown is lifted by 1st of June, the government is ready. There's a certain kind of a mechanism that has already been in place, which should be, if there's an overwhelming case of corona, the government is ready in that sense.
Yeah.
But if you say, India has not been able to do it long time back, yes, we have not been able to, because as I said, pandemics come unannounced. So we have to, initial days it takes time, but after that we are able to tackle it. The way we have done it for polio now. Polio is completely eradicated in our country. Smallpox is completely eradicated. People don't die of malaria anymore. So that's the kind of thing that.
Yeah.
Hope I was able to answer all your three.
Thank you, Vemula.
Thank you, Ravindra Vemulaji.
Just one thing. Thank you, Vemula, for your brilliant presentation. And I am really happy as an educator. You have given food for thought for the scholars. The document that you have shared, I am sure the communication scholars and the teachers can take it up and do some research and collect data, primary data from the people, and make some studies and go for some publications. That's a wonderful document that you have shared. I'm happy, very happy for that. And this is a task for my young colleagues and researchers to utilize that document and do studies in their own areas and go for publications. Thank you very much, Vemula. And Anupa is there waiting for so long. Anupa, I welcome Anupa again. Okay, thank you, Vemula.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ravindra Vemulaji. We are really thankful and grateful to you that you have joined with us and you share your experience, and your discussion is very useful and fruitful to all our research scholars and the young media educators. I personally thankful to you and grateful to you that you have joined with us. Then now we will go for our next session, the second session, that Dr. Anupa is already with us. So let me welcome Dr. Anupa Lakar Goswami. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Journalism, Guwahati University. She is a master's in mass communication from Tezpur Central University, Assam, and completed her PhD from Assam, Don Bosco University. a news reader in the Doordarshan Kendra Guwahati. She has interest in the creative writing and is also interested in online media studies with research articles published on the same in various peer-reviewed journals. She has also been involved in the projects with the UNICEF, IIMC and IITG. I welcome Dr. Anupa to our second session of today's webinar. And now I request Dr. Anupa to continue her discussion.
But I must congratulate Upendra Babu and Manranjan, Nishit, and all Chiki, the wonderful team of Padibabu for organizing such a wonderful webinar. And I get a lot of responses personally from the participants. They are all happy. The very purpose of this webinar for the participants, let me tell you, you must have been seeing a lot of webinars happening all over the country, mostly on media during post-COVID, during media and the challenges of media during COVID-19, in and around COVID-19, as if COVID-19 has, there is nothing else in this world now except COVID-19. But we as communication scholars must ensure and must realize that we will have to look beyond COVID-19. And COVID-19 is something that has come and that has affected us, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all the deliberations, all the experts should only talk about COVID-19. And myself being a person of around 64 years, I have been listening to my colleagues, the older colleagues all over. I have listened to them for the last 35 years. And the basic purpose, what myself and Professor Upendra Padiji, we thought that it is always, because I have visited almost all the universities and places in the country, and I have come across young people, those who are doing terrific job. They work tremendously in the communication sector, and they are not to be heard, they are not to be seen. People do not know much about them. So what we thought that we will create a platform where the young scholars, those who are doing a wonderful job in communication academics and research, we must give them an opportunity, create a platform for them for sharing their views, for sharing their work. And during the last 3 days, I tell you, I'm very honest, except one, I will not name, except one, perhaps all the other lectures were very good. They're wonderful, and my congratulations to all of them. And I'm sure my younger colleagues must have been benefited by that. And in the coming days also, you have seen the list, we have people, the younger people, but they have specialized in certain areas. They have specialized in certain areas. Somebody today will be listening to, we listen to health, and now we'll listen to photojournalism. Later on, we will be listening to social marketing. Later on, there are many topics which cover the whole spectrum of communication studies and research. So we have tried to move beyond little COVID-19. Something that this is a normal activity even in times of Corona, COVID-19. Let us not be plagued by COVID-19, and we should keep our mind straight and steady. And we must also talk about other things which relate to the discipline. That was the very purpose. One, to create a platform for the younger colleagues, and secondly, to move little away from COVID-19 and talk about things which do have a bearing on the communication discipline. That was the very purpose. And I think we have achieved, we have succeeded in our efforts, and I'm sure within the coming 6 days or 5 days, we will be able to do that. I know there are many other young scholars, those who are capable of delivering good lectures, and we will also create opportunities for them. I wish you all the best for the webinar series.
Very good afternoon to everyone present here. So first of all, as suggested by Behra sir, and I also thought that instead of talking about the relevant, about coronavirus this time, I thought I'll try to talk about something a little different
Yeah.
from, what the current topic is, but very much applicable to everyday journalism. So I'll be
Yes.
talking about documenting emotions and realism through photojournalism. So photojournalism is something that I really enjoy teaching in the classroom, or enjoy.
This is your presentation, am I right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so talking about emotions and realism through photojournalism, every day we are exposed to so many photographs. Currently, most of us are logged online, so we are actually seeing the world. We are actually reading the newspapers. We are doing everything, but it's only the photographs that give us the real picture. So because I decided to divide the photos into two categories, basically realism and emotions. It is very difficult to actually separate emotions and realism from each other, because both of them are integral parts of each other. But then I thought that perhaps I'll try to mix up both of them and I'll talk in between. So photojournalism, how is it different from photography? A lot of people say that a photographer is also a photojournalist, but I would like to deviate on that, because a photographer has more artistic elements and he is more into aesthetics and color, whereas a photojournalism has to do a lot of things like collecting photos that makes news, and then editing newsworthy photographs, presenting news materials, employs images to tell a story, and sometimes even a videographer can be said to be a photojournalist. So the next part, we will move on to the next slide. Yes, documenting realism. Now, realism, of course, is not much of a style. You don't have a style. Photojournalists don't have an option saying that, see, I'll be unrealistic and I'll be artistic, but rather it's a fundamental quality. He has to have the realism element in photojournalism, without which the photo will not have an essence or a soul. I'll start with the famous photographer Lewis Hines. What interests me about Lewis Hines. I think we'll move on to the next slide. Lewis Hines is a photographer who has been. Can we move on to the next slide? Yeah. Yeah. So Lewis Hines is known for documenting realism. If you see the stories of Lewis Hines, actually, he was more of a reformist and a realist rather than a photojournalist. He had disguised himself as as a Bible salesman, as a person who, as a mechanic of machineries, and he tried to capture pictures of children working in different parts of America during the early part of 1920s and 30s. So he had done an extensive documentation. This is actually realism. A 5-year-old boy carrying, yeah, I'll get to it. Do we have to get to the questions immediately, or should we do later? Yes?
We can do at the end of the session. We can do at the end of the session.
Yeah, sure. Then no problem. So first of all, this is a picture of a boy carrying a hat in New York City. Like I said, he used to capture, these kind of regular stories. We move on to the next picture. Can we move on to the next picture? Yes. This other picture, this is another picture of a girl who's getting a glimpse of the outer world. This last boy that we spoke about, he was just 5 years old, and this girl is 11 years old. She's been working for a year. So he had traveled extensively to the whole of Northwest and South of America to cover these photographs of child workers who are employed. So much so that by the end of 1938, there was a law which was passed, labor laws which were passed in America to curtail, child labor in America. The next photograph, can we see it? Can we? Yeah, this is another picture of a newspaper boy who's sleeping on the stairs. This is a photograph of a 5-year-old boy who's jumping off the trolley, and he's selling newspapers. One good thing about Lewis Hines was that he tried to mix himself. He did not stand out as a photographer where people were conscious, but rather he mixed himself with the situation where everybody was doing their job. Even the children would feel that he was part of their, their work, work environment, and they used to behave exactly there, in a very natural way. That was realism captured by Lewis Hines. Can we move on to the next picture? Yes, this is another 5-year-old boy who's collecting shrimps, and every year he had to collect, every day he had to collect almost 20 to 30 kgs of shrimp. So this was another, brutal picture of childhood that was being destroyed, and he had captured it very beautifully through his pictures. Can we move on to the next picture? Yeah, this is another picture of a newspaper boy who's asleep in stairs with papers. This shows the predicament of the children during that time. This was in New Jersey. If you have noticed all the photographs, one of them is in Missouri, another them is in Wisconsin, another them is in New Jersey. So we have seen how Lewis Hines has traveled extensively as a photojournalist, and he has covered all these stories. As we see, can we move on to the next picture again? Yeah. So this is another picture. So these children were involved in cutting sardines and fish. So they used to the entire floor used to be so slippery that these children used to fall off in between, and they used to cut himself really bad. So he had done a documentation of these children and what kind of risky situations they were working every day. Lewis Hines was extremely careful in making sure that these children were not conscious that he was a documenter or photojournalist, but rather he would disguise himself saying that I'm trying to find out what kind of work you're doing. And this is how he had got the real situation there. So can we move on to the next picture? Yes. Yes. So, a realist is someone who actually tries to get hold of the entire situation, and through his pictures, like we saw in Lewis Hines, he was extremely loyal to his realism. Just like we know the story of Nanook of the North, how the film was done by Robert Flaherty. He had dissolved himself in the situation so much so that people did not feel that he was an external character. Similarly, even another photographer that we have, Henry Cartier-Bresson, he was well known for documenting historic events. Unlike Lewis Hines, he was not a reformist, but you can call him a humanist, because he has captured human emotions and some of the most prolific events of the history. Because of the lack of time, I just took this thing. Yeah. So because of the lack of time, I just took two events. First of all, some 4 photographs from the India during his times. Can we move on to the next picture? Yes. So Henry Cartier-Bresson had traveled extensively. He was also a part of the Magnum Photos, we know, and he had traveled throughout during the immediately after independence. And this was a refugee camp in post-India. While Lewis Hines was clearly, very much a photojournalist, Henry Cartier-Bresson has artistic elements in his photographs. So most of these photographs, despite being very real, you would feel that some of these could have been choreographed, or some of them, he would have, placed these things exactly as it is. But no, he had a way with lines during all his photography. This was one of the refugee camps post-independence in India. He had an artistic way of delivering it. Next picture. Yeah, can we move on to the next picture? Yeah, this is another picture of Henry Cartier-Bresson, who had taken the picture of beggars begging in South India. This was another. Most of these pictures of Henry Cartier-Bresson's have these diagonal lines. If you have noticed, even the other picture and this picture, they have diagonal lines which are artistic. It entirely gets you. You give all the attention to this picture, and you start seeing this from another level. Can we move on to the next picture? Yes. This is another picture from Kashmir, Srinagar in 1944. This was just before, Kashmir. This was before Nehru had signed the treaty, and this was a picture of the women in Kashmir, and this was just very random. Henry Cartier-Bresson had traveled extensively, so he wanted to capture events, and most of these faces you won't see, but you can see the emotion here. I mean, it's very difficult to not understand the emotions through his picture. Can we move on to the next picture? Yes, this is another picture from Madurai, Tamil Nadu, 1950. Now, if you see this picture, you can see the wheels. the wheels, and you can see the ribs of the young boy who's, you know, probably very starved. He's suffering from starvation. So this was a realistic picture of Henry Cartier-Bresson in the 1950s, when India had actually post-independence. There were a lot of you know, economic upheaval, a lot of starvation that was going on because a lot of settlement need to be done. So this was another picture of Henry Cartier-Bresson. You can see that the wheels are very symbolic of the ribs of the small child. Can you move on to the next picture? Yes, this was another picture of the refugee camp in Kurukshetra, Punjab, where the people were engaged in a kind of a game to keep themselves occupied. This was Henry Cartier-Bresson was very much of an artist. You know, in most of his picture, you will understand the emotion. Like in Madurai, you had seen the apathy of the child. Here you can see how people have engaged themselves in a game in the refugee camps themselves. Can we move on to the next picture? Yes. Call him lucky, or you call him, you know, on time always. Henry Cartier-Bresson was always perfectly on time. In fact, this one was one of the pictures of Mahatma Gandhi some hours before he was shot dead. And this, I know we all identify this picture as as one of few of the last pictures of Mahatma Gandhi. Very beautifully captured. Can we move on to the next picture? This was after Mahatma Gandhi was shot dead and Nehru had announced before a crying crowd about his assassination in New Delhi, 1948. The entire picture had a symbolic element in it. There were lights. This was another picture of Gandhi's secretary watching the first flames of the funeral pyre in New Delhi. This was Nehru behind him, who was trying to, control the crowd. And this was a picture of anguish, as well as, a picture where we see what could possibly be the new India without Gandhi. Yes, this was another picture where Henry Cartier-Bresson had traveled all the way to China to talk about the last few days of, to see the last few days of Beijing before it was taken over by the Maoist regime. Can we move on to the next picture? This was the gold rush during China, because before the arrival of the Maoist troop, these were the last few days of the Kuomintang. So you can well imagine, what kind of a situation was there before the Maoists had come. People had actually gone to purchase, the gold, so that they knew that the new regime, it would be very difficult to have an economic sustenance. Can we move on to the next picture? This was another picture of a mother huddling her baby close to her, and she had moved on to the new city, and she had written there that my name is Sun, and my husband had died of illness. Very symbolic of the emotions of China during that time. Now, since there are a lot of pictures of Henry Cartier-Bresson, I'm sure it will not be, I'm pretty sure I have not been very loyal to Henry Cartier-Bresson, because in terms of his presentations of picture, there are so many, but I thought that I would give a representation to most of these photojournalists during that time who had captured realism. Homai Vyarawala, she was one of the first photojournalists of India. I tried to, provide, I tried to provide just two pictures of her, of capturing realism in India. Can we move on to the next picture? This was one of the pictures in 1956 when Nehru had released a dove during his birthday, which we today celebrate as Children's Day. The another picture was of Lord Mountbatten among jubilant crowds. It was in 1945. We can see that India is, India is on the verge of being an independent country, and it is. There was a lot of jubilant crowd. There were a lot of people who had gathered together, and this was one historic or realistic element that Homai Vyarawala had in her pictures. Another one was Homai Vyarawala was very well known for capturing life and times of different people during different events. This was one of the pictures. I just wanted to show you this because she would just go in to certain places and she would just capture random pictures, candid pictures, which was today we know that candid pictures have taken over the entire photo industry, but she was one of them who had started the candid picture, candid picture tradition in India. Can we move on to the next picture? This was Homai Vyarawala. Another person who is known as the father of photojournalism, T.S. Satyan. T.S. Satyan also had realistic elements in his photograph. Can we move on to the next picture? This was, the angst. I just found this photo very interesting among all his pictures, because other pictures would not have been so just, able to justify his element of realism. You see the passion in these people, how they are trying to build a new India. So that was symbolic. T.S. Satyan was actually a person who had metaphorical elements through most of his pictures. Can we move on to the next? Yes. Why only political or events that made news? I thought if events made news, even sports journalism was not without any realism. Tony Duffy, who's known as honestly the father of sports journalism, his first photograph, he was actually a technician working in one of the offices, and he had actually taken his Leica camera and gone to capture. He just attended the Olympics. Can we move on to the next picture? So this was, this was the famous photograph of Bob Beamon in 1968 Summer Olympics. That was the element of realism in sports that Tony Duffy had covered during his times, and this was what made him, very famous all throughout. This was published in almost all the photographs, and it was sold in a whooping amount. And after that, Tony Duffy was known as capturing realism in sports. This was the historic jump of Bob Beamon. Another person, of course, these pictures are not easily downloaded, so I had to, take it from some, some website. Cecil Beaton, he was, the royal family felt that they could not connect to the real, the people. So the royal family decided to have a photo session where they wanted that, let the people see us as one of them. So these sentiments were, very beautifully captured by Cecil Beaton in trying to reconnect the candid pictures, in trying to reconnect the family with the ordinary people. Okay, so this was realism according to me. You may just contest that where does realism and emotion stand apart from each other, because here you can see emotions also, but realism is a little different in the sense that it tries to give you the picture that it exactly is. Though this is, hugely, candid, and this was hugely, choreographed by Cecil Beaton, but I also find that there are certain, emotions, candid emotions of the royal family which were given out in an attempt to connect to the normal people, ordinary crowd of London. Can we move on to the next? Okay, so emotions, conflict, disasters, human interest stories. Many emotions are portrayed over the years through photojournalism. This is something that I feel, like many of you have said, that COVID-19 and emotions, pictures have portrayed emotions. So I feel that emotions are nothing but when you try to capture, every photograph, every human being, every, emotion or every disaster, you find emotions there. And it is only through photojournalism that it's possible. Can we move on to the next? Of course, being a media educator, you should not have your favorite photojournalist, but I think, I would be biased by saying that he's one of my favorite photojournalists, because he has been out in the field and he has covered so many war photographs and events that it's, that I would not be able to see war if I had not, war in from another point of view if it had not been for James Natway. In fact, James Natway, in most of his photographs, or though he is called a war journalist, he likes to call himself an anti-war journalist, because he feels that he has covered so many events and wars and tragedies that he feels that through his pictures, people should know that these wars should not be repeated over again. Can we move on to the next picture? Yes, this is some of this, that is why James Natway likes to call himself an anti-war photojournalist, because he feels that through his pictures, he tries to capture emotion. This is a picture of an Afghan widow, and this is a burial site. There are nameless, faceless people in this cremation site. And this is one picture without any photo, without seeing her emotion, you can then understand the pain. This is just one, spectacular picture of James Natway of capturing emotion. Can we move on to the next? Yes. Yes, this is another very popular picture of Kabul in 1996, which was ravaged by the Taliban and the war. And this actually captures the entire ravage of Afghanistan. What it had been through, and a woman silently walking. This picture has haunted a lot of people over the years. It's a very haunting picture, and it gives you the entire impact of a war. Can we move on to the next? This is a picture of James Natry from his collection called Inferno, where he had captured all these war pictures. This is another one where he was there at the moment where a wounded Marine in Iraq was brought to the medics room, and the medics were curious. Some were trying to handle the situation. There were angst. There were a lot of anxiety in the room, and the anxiety in the room has been very beautifully captured by James Natry. This is the emotion that we're talking about. Can we move on to the next? This is another picture of the Hutu camp in Rwanda in 1994. There's no war, but the impacts of the war can be seen through the scars in the boy's face. This is another very award-winning picture of James Natry, where he again tries to tell you that he tries to capture realism not because he feels that he wants to sell or capitalize on realism. Rather, he feels that if people don't see the real thing, they will never know that what's going on in the world. Can we move on to the next? This is another picture in Palestine. Yeah. So this is another picture in Palestine where there were people. They are throwing petrol bottles out in the war. It was taken in Ramallah, West Bank in 2000. There were a lot of fatal results. You can well understand where the photojournalist has placed himself. Again, I said, sometimes photojournalists are lucky and sometimes they are actually always on time. They have a perfect timing. I think, it is fortunately unfortunate for James Natry to have been present in New York when the WTC World Trade Center was crashed. So he was there on 10th September. So on 11th September, he had captured this, very powerful photograph outside, near the near the ravages of the World Trade Center. This cross, people might think that emotions are only related to a human, a person reacting to it. But sometimes emotions are not always about human beings, but they are also about inanimate objects. Here, the cross is an inanimate object, but the emotion is very powerful. That even in the face of all this, there's a devastation. Yes, most of these photos have won a number of awards. In fact, James Natry has won a number of awards. Same goes for Bresson. And in fact, almost all the photojournalists that I have chosen have won awards. And most of these pictures have been taken from their, either from Magnum Photos or other, other award-winning exhibitions. This is another picture that was taken by James Natry. I like this particular picture because you don't see dead bodies, you don't see mangled bodies, you don't see things that disturb you, but rather a very horrifying reality of what happens in the face of a conflict. We only think that only mangled bodies give us give us pain, but this is something that it's just a catastrophe that has occurred, and you understand the pain even through these ash and smoke and shattered glasses. Can we move on to the next? Yes. James Natry had also extensively done two other very important series of photography. One was on war and another was on disease. He had done one on life, he had done one on hepatitis E and a lot of disease. It was in West Darfur in 2004. You understand the pain of the women and the son, and he was there exactly at this moment, not trying to bank on this emotion, but rather to capture and send the message across what was going on in West Darfur. Can we move on to the next? Yes. I think all of you, once you see a picture, you would like to understand more about and research. After I had seen this picture, I had done a research on Father Michael Bossano. He was there. He is actually one of the, faces in Thailand who has been tending to AIDS patients for a long time. And most of these AIDS patients, what he does, he nurtures them. He changes their diaper, and every day he's there with them. So instead of covering the face of Father Michael Bossano, James Natry covered the, trust, the element of compassion, through his, through his hand, and the, element of trust that this AIDS patient had given, had on the on Father. This was in one of his another series called The World Free of Tuberculosis. It was a documentation. Can we move on to the next? Yes, this was another photograph from World Free of Tuberculosis. He had taken the picture, after a funeral of this boy's mother, He's a Cambodian boy, a 12-year-old, who holds a portrait of his mother during her which was taken from her wedding pictures. So this was another very powerful picture that he tried to portray, that the world is not free from tuberculosis and there are a lot of deaths that are still occurring because of tuberculosis. Can we move on to the next? Dorothea Lange, I know it's not synchromatic because in terms of time frame, she is much more advanced than James Natchway, but she was also someone who was responsible for capturing the emotions of refugees. She is a humanist in pure terms. Can we move on to the next? She had covered very powerful pictures of depression during 1933 and 1936. This was a picture of the water supply American river camp. She had done extensively. She had first started capturing pictures, thinking that she would do she would just try to capture emotions and, just try to document everything. But towards the end, she became a part of these, people. She just saw that everyday life had so many stories to be told. And this was depression. People were moving from one place to another in vehicles. They were trying to get whatever food material they could get. Yeah. So this was most of these photojournalists are award-winning journalists. Not most, in fact, all of them. Yeah. So can we move on to the next? Yeah. So how can we forget Raghu Rai, who had frozen emotions in time? One of the most powerful pictures of Raghu Rai was the one with. Can we move on to the next? Yeah. Yeah, can we move on to the next photograph? Yeah, one of the most powerful pictures of Raghu Rai is the Bhopal gas tragedy in photograph. Raghu Rai himself says that when he went to cover Bhopal gas tragedy, after a point of time, he became suffocated covering dead bodies and people, and he thought that this was too much for him to, it was too much for him to talk about, but this was one powerful picture through which he tried to portray all the sentiments of Bhopal gas tragedy, and this picture still haunts us and has become the poster picture of Bhopal gas tragedy. Another picture of India during the 1979, a very powerful picture of where women is, women were, subdued during those times. But this is a picture where women becomes a part of the force, workforce in India. Can we move on to the next? Steve McCurry, time and timelessness. People, can we move on to the next picture so that I can talk about him? Yes. This was the picture of Sharbat Gulla that he had taken in 1994. He thought that this was a very powerful picture. He had moved on through all these refugee camps in the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and he had captured the picture of this 14-year-old girl in 1994. So this haunting eyes, had been the poster picture for Times Magazine and a number of other magazines. Although Steve McCurry was also criticized later on for trying to, for exploiting this. But he, this picture had won him accolades for, the situation that was there in Afghanistan. In 2000, the picture had so much of impact that 20 years later, people had actually, Steve McCurry had actually gone out to find where Sharbat Gulla was, and they still found her in a refugee camp in Pakistan, which created a furore, saying that there was, the destiny of people in Afghanistan was still unsure, and the Afghan president had actually brought Sharbat Gulla back. So this was the impact of photojournalism. Can we move on to the next? This is another one of the most contemporary photographer, Arko Datta. I'm sure you must have seen his picture of the tsunami. Can we move on to the next? Yeah, can we move on to the next photograph? Yes. Can we move on to the next photograph, please? Yeah, this was one of the pictures of tsunami which had won him. Sorry, the next photo, the next slide. Yeah, This was one of the pictures of the tsunami that had won him a number of awards, and people actually understood the emotion. A woman was there lying near the shore. She was crying, and this had won Argo Datta the recognition that he is there today. This picture was so powerful that without any dead body, without any disturbing element, you still understand the impact that the natural disaster had on these people. Another defining image of the Gujarat riots was of that of Qutbuddin Ansari in February 2008. It was so powerful, and that there were a number of news stories which had covered a follow-up story on Qutbuddin Ansari post this picture. And this picture was one of the defining moments of Gujarat riots, and people wanted to find out exactly what had happened. He was a tailor, and he was actually, standing in front of his, shop, which was completely burned down by the riots. So communal rights and the horrors associated with it, you can see it through his eyes. This was such a powerful emotion captured by Arko Datta. Can we move on to the next? So everybody's talking about contemporary photographs. I thought that these pictures of migrants are some of the most, telltale emotions of the situation that we are going through currently right now. These pictures have been covered randomly. Sometimes they have been covered in a very planned manner, trying to chronicle or document what the situation of migrants are. And it is through this picture that we understand that human emotions are so powerful, yet if one single image can be reflective. This is the first picture is that of a UP migrant who had lost his 1-year-old son, and I'm sure there have been a lot of stories that you've read about him, how he has been finally sent home. Such has been the power of this picture, that without this picture we would not have been able to understand perhaps what are the predicaments, or what are the horrors that these people are facing every day. Another picture is a man who's carrying his child in his who has been traveling for the last 2-3 days without proper food, and whatever they can collect on the way they have been eating. This other picture is a symbol of mass exodus that has happened in the wake of economic crisis, as well as a pandemic which has gone beyond a human control. And despite all political allegations, what I feel that these pictures are so powerful that these tell us about what could be the impact, and they also tell us about the impact that this pandemic is likely to have in the current days. The next picture is a man who's carrying 2 of his children in a cart. Such a moving picture that the government has been forced, the Supreme Court has forced the government now to take these migrants home, all on their cost, provide them with food, and every day these compelling pictures let us know that we cannot be at peace when the migrants have not reached their homes. The last picture. Yeah, this is one of the last pictures that I've taken for today's session, because it also tells us about when we only criticize, saying that we cannot control our people, we also should understand that this pandemic has also led to a global furor. A lot of people across the world are unable to control their, the human emotions. This is a woman who stands up against the medics who are trying to control and asking them to stay at home, which is not, which is not followed. And we understand in terms of through these photojournalism, through these photographs, that this pandemic is not just situated or just located to one geographical area, but it's stretched far and beyond. And there are people across the world who are trying to control it through any means, through every means. So I think with this, I'm done with my session. I mean, so if there are any questions, I would like to entertain them as of now.
So, ma'am, you go ahead with this question. Let me add some more questions.
So the first question, how far is the use of photo editing software ethical in journalism? How do we decide their quantum of use? First of all, photo editing softwares can be used till the point that you're trying to use color or other forms, but photo editing and photo doctoring are two different elements. A lot of people confuse photo editing with that of photo doctoring. Photo doctoring is not a good element in photojournalism, because the moment you doctor, you are actually tampering with facts. So there is no quantum, or there is no particular quantity that, okay, this is the element till which I can doctor, and this is I can not. So I don't think so. Photo doctoring is a good element. However, photo editing softwares, if you try to filter it, if you use a little bit of light, I think that is still permissible as long as you're not using it for an award where you are, you're purely judged on the basis of your aesthetics. So there is no quantum of use if you're actually photo doctoring. But yes, photo editing is okay as far as you're just trying to accentuate the element of light or contrast to make it more aesthetic, nothing else. Yes. During the coronavirus, so many fake photographs were published by recognized newspapers, but no action was taken against them. Fake news, that just like I've said, photo doctoring and fake photographs are, one of the most, recent, recent problems that we are all facing. Recognized newspapers, I think, just 2 years back, also 3 years back, Hindu had published a photograph of a woman who was trampled in a in a stampede that had occurred in one of the footbridges in Mumbai. And then later, the next day, Hindu had issued an apology saying that it was purely a fake news. I think most of these newspapers can take this ethical stand and accept the fact that these photographs are fake. But most recognized papers nowadays themselves have fact checkers in their organizations. So that is why through these fact checkers, if they find that this newspaper or someone complains that this particular photograph has not been correct, then they can issue a corrigendum the next day. And no action has been taken. Of course, if till the time no one files a case or issues, even the PCI has taken a radical stand against fake news. So I think this is enough. Yeah. Question number 3. Yeah, contemporary pictures. Yeah, I thought till if we don't understand the history, contemporary pictures are towards the end. I did try to include some of the contemporary pictures, but it was not possible for me to include most pictures because the session was quite limited in terms of time. You need one whole day for contemporary pictures actually, and you also need to understand that many pictures are also used as propaganda tools. So you have to be extremely careful from not to include such photographs which are more about propaganda. Yes. Question number 4. Can we move on to question number 4? Yeah.
This one.
Many photojournalists actually, since you're a photographer, I'm sure you understand that many photojournalists suffer from trauma. They also suffer from a lot of trauma. Like Raghu Rai himself had said that he had undergone through trauma after covering Bhopal gas tragedy. James Natry himself says that he went through a lot of trauma after he covered the Iraq war. So many journalists cover trauma, but a journalist also understand that there's a difference between exploitation and exploration. They sometimes know that instead of when they cover a conflict or when they cover a bloodbath somewhere, they're not exploiting the people for a particular photograph, but rather they want to explore and give people the exact picture as it is. Yes. Yeah. Next question. When it comes to photojournalism, important technical aspects of photography. Technical, I don't think so. Sometimes in photojournalism, technical is fine, but a photojournalist cannot always be ready technically thinking that, okay, I will present it this way or present it that way. Rather, a photojournalist has to be sometimes, has to be on the spot without being technically correct. Like one of those pictures of James Cartier-Bresson, where we saw the photograph of Nehru addressing the people. He was not technically correct. There were a lot of flaws in the particular picture, but instead of basing himself on technicality, he just wanted to capture the moment so that he can transfer he communicate the emotion to the people. Ethics in capturing realism, that's what I said. For a photojournalist, there is always a thin line between exploitation. Steve McCurry was criticized in many of his is one of his pictures of the Afghan girl, saying that he had exploited the girl's innocence, because after after the picture was taken, a lot of people from a village had said that, why did you go out, why do you go to school, why did you let a outsider take your picture? So they say that a lot of harm was done. Besides, there are a lot of elements where you actually expose a person to risk. For example, Ansari. In case of Ansari, I think there were a lot of cases that were done. But apart from that, there are a lot of times where you actually risk a person by showing his face. People want to be, most of these local channels, they show the photo of a victim of generally a victim who is a female, a victim of violence. In that case, the realism does not count. In that case, ethics becomes more important. And I think photojournalism, ethics and journalism are more or less the same. Candid photography or ambush photography, no consent is taken from the subject. That's very true. But you have to understand that if this candid photography does not risk anybody, so risk anybody's life, or it does not risk anybody's reputation, that is still fine. But the moment you feel that it's just for your particular interest, and then you try to risk that person saying that, okay, fine, let me take it, let me like the pictures of James Natry, you must have seen that the photographs of the people who were throwing the petrol bombs, he had not taken that particular photograph, because he knew that the moment he had taken the he had taken the frontal view, he would risk these people. So those are actually some innate qualities that a photojournalist should have, when he understand that he has a responsibility towards his subject also, and revealing identities, especially in marginalized community. There's a very powerful picture of Arko Datta on LGBT community. I'm responding to Priyam Ghosh, of two men kissing. That was done when India had, when in India LGBT was no longer a crime. That was the particular date that he had decided to disclose their identity, and he had also taken that permission. So very few journalists do that. And a journalist would not like, you must be aware that a lot of photojournalists also have cases filed against them because of intrusion of privacy, which is not true, or which is not good. Yes. Ethical issues, first of all, you should not exploit your subject. Secondly, you should also understand that you have to be extremely correct. Thirdly, you should not try to promote propaganda through news. That is why I've been saying that in case of current contemporary photographs, I had to be extremely careful, because had I taken some of those photographs which were completely for propaganda, where I'm trying to, where I see a particular politician trying to distribute food among the migrants, trying to get a mileage, or a particular person doing it. So in that case, you have to understand that you're not promoting any propaganda, rather you're trying to give the true picture. Secondly, a photojournalist also, a perception of a photojournalist also matters. If a perception of a photojournalist is already prejudiced while going to take a photograph, thinking that, okay, fine, I'll try to take a photograph in such a manner that I'll try to present her as a victim, in that case, it becomes completely difficult for you to understand the real situation. Yeah. With the increasing penetration of smartphones and pixel cameras, yes, citizen journalism is also proliferating. In fact, most of these, in fact, one of the first pictures of, W Trade Center was taken by a person, a random tourist. That was one of the beginning of, I think, some of the beginning of the citizen journalism. In fact, Tony Duffy himself had taken a Leica camera and had just clicked a random picture. Photojournalists are, citizen journalists, they try, sometimes out of fluke or sometimes out of pure passion, they they click perfect photographs, and they, make great stories out of it. But sometimes it also happens, like I said, it also depends upon our point of view. Most of these people are not aware of ethics that are involved in photojournalism, and hence it becomes a little risky effort. Yes. As technology is available, faking becomes another endemic. Of course, faking, I said, photo doctoring is one of the most difficult challenges that one has to face at this point of time. We had seen a photograph of Yogi Adityanath, he was drinking cow urine. That was also photo doctored. Another picture was where I think Trump and Modi were sitting together, and there was another where Trump was had snided Modi. There was another, Modi was giving a certain look to Trump. That was also photo doctored. So most of these photo doctored photographs are, they are rife on social media, and it's very difficult for you to identify. So I would suggest that you go to fact checkers, or you go to alt news, or you try. There are different. Google also has its own, domain where you can actually check fake news or fake photographs. So this is something that is crucial for you to understand before you circulate a fake photograph. Yeah, Kevin Carter, I think that was another photograph where Kevin Carter had, he was stuck between ethics, and he was stuck between, trying to get the picture of a person, of a small boy who was starving. And there was a picture of another vulture who would prey on the boy as soon as he would die. He had taken that particular photograph, and he had, after that photograph went viral, millions of money was funded for Sudan. So we would take that as a credit. But Kevin Carter was also criticized, saying that why didn't he go and help the child rather than taking the photograph? So he was criticized of exploiting the child for which he himself had committed suicide. But again, we have to understand that just like I said, every photojournalist goes through trauma of certain kind. So in fact, that child did not die then. He had lived up to around 11 or 12 years, and he died out of another disease after some point of time. But even then, a photojournalist goes through a lot of dilemma while being on the spot, because he realizes that being realistic is important, because people should know what are the horrors that are going on. At the same time, he should know that he should not risk someone for the sake of getting a good capture. And thirdly, he should also know that he also has a responsibility as a journalist. Perhaps a photojournalist has equal amount of responsibility as that of a journalist. So whatever responsibility he has, he knows that the moment that photograph is sent out, a lot of public emotions can be captured, and a lot of a lot good can be done through it.
Bijay, if you have any questions, you have raised hand. I have unmuted. You can ask questions now. Okay, we'll move on.
Thank you, Nishit. Thank you, madam. Now we are planning to wrap up this session over here. Since Professor Sunil Kant Behera, our webinar advisor, is us, so I request Professor Behera if he can put some words on the discussion of Dr. Anupa, it will be good for us. Dr. Sunil Kant Behera, please.
Well, first I congratulate Anupa for this very informative and engaging session. And what more will I say, when it has generated a lot of questions and lot of responses. I was looking at the charts, and there were about 10-11 questions from the participants. So this only indicates that the lecture was very engaging, and certainly talking about emotions and talking about realities. These certainly add value to photograph. And when we think about photo doctoring, and again, when you think about the fact checkers are there, fact checking sites are there, one need to, that is a problem that we are facing with the onset of the online media and the mobile phones, smartphones. Everybody has become a photojournalist, it seems. And that is the rise of citizen journalism. That is a good sign. But at the same time, the use and abuse of this kind of technology has to be. Technology is good, but how we use it, that's very, very important. So it depends on the people, those who use it and abuse it. So we should be careful in selecting the photographs and fact checking those photographs and news and everything. And regarding the emotions and reality, that certainly adds meaning to the photographs. Without whether talking about the Carter's photo of the vulture waiting for the boy to die, certainly that the harsh reality. But again, when it comes to ethics, he should not have published that photograph. That's what. So there is a thin line. When we teach in our classes about ethics also in journalism, there is always a thin line that separates in this business media, today's business media, and we can't be so ethical. Somewhere we will have to draw a line, and we will have to balance both the things. Wonderful talk, Anupa. I'm so happy about that. And there's a lot of responses, lot of questions. So I congratulate you and thank you very much for this engaging session. It is wonderful.
Thank you, sir. Let me congratulate Dr. Anupa. Really, we are grateful and thankful to you that you were able to join with us, sparing your valuable time from your busy schedule. You join with us, and your session was totally very useful for all of our participants. Really, we are all thankful to you, and we also seek the same support and cooperation from your end in our future endeavor also. So with these words, I again congratulate and thank you, our research person and our advisor and all the participants joined in this today's webinar. Friends, we will wrap up this session over here. Again, I request you all tomorrow at the 11 o'clock. Again, we will join with our new resource persons and new topics in tomorrow's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you,
for
thank
giving
you.
me the opportunity. Thank you.